The first explosions hit at 4:12 a.m., shattering the silence over a frozen rail yard on the outskirts of Melitopol. Two Russian vehicles, one transporting a drone crew scheduled for a reconnaissance mission, were supposed to move before sunrise. Instead, they sat immobilized, surrounded by scattered debris and panicked soldiers. At almost the same hour, nearly 600 miles away, a communications tower in Bashkortostan went dark, its relay cabinet engulfed in flames. And just 36 hours later, a drone strike ripped through Moscow's Ring pipeline, a massive artery pumping more than 3 million tons of jet fuel and gasoline across Russia each day. The Kremlin called it a technical malfunction, but satellite imagery leaked to Reuters told a different story. Precision hits, coordinated timing, and sabotage patterns identical to attacks seen in occupied Ukraine. This wasn't Ukraine's conventional army. This wasn't HIMARS or Storm Shadows or long-range drones fired from the border. This was something far more unnerving for Vladimir Putin. Because every one of these attacks across 3 regions hundreds of miles apart was carried out by people Russia claimed it controlled. Some were Ukrainian partisans buried deep inside occupied territory. Others were Russian citizens, factory workers, railway technicians, students, who decided to wage a war from within, striking Putin's war machine where it was weakest, its own territory. Intelligence reports from Euromaidan Press and the Kyiv Independent describe a shadow network now conducting up to 30 sabotage operations per month, a number that tripled between 2024 and 2025. The Kremlin once dismissed these groups as scattered extremists, but the November wave revealed something much darker: coordination, precision, and inside help. And then the unthinkable happened. Russia's security services realized they could not identify, track, or contain the attackers because the resistance wasn't outside the system. It was inside Russia itself. The war Vladimir Putin expected to dominate quickly has instead fractured into 2 distinct fronts: the visible battlefield in Ukraine and a second, far more unpredictable conflict unfolding in the shadows of Russia's own territory. To understand how this happened, one has to revisit the assumptions Moscow made in February 2022. The Kremlin believed that overwhelming troop numbers, armored thrusts, and missile barrages would force Kyiv into submission within weeks. Russian state media portrayed the invasion as a liberation. The political elite expected minimal resistance in the occupied regions and absolute obedience at home. But reality broke that narrative almost immediately. In the first months of occupation, small, disorganized sabotage acts emerged in places like Kherson, Luhansk, and Melitopol. At first, these were isolated incidents: homemade explosives, graffiti, disrupted rail lines. Russian commanders dismissed them as a nuisance. Yet even then, Ukrainian intelligence understood something Moscow did not. These early acts were the seeds of a movement capable of reshaping the entire conflict. By 2023, organizations such as Atesh, Freedom of Russia Legion, and several unnamed partisan cells became more structured. As reported by Euromaidan Press, these groups blended local volunteers, former Ukrainian security personnel trapped behind the lines, and Russian citizens outraged by the Kremlin's war. They operated with minimal resources but maximum adaptability. Cheap explosives, modified vehicles, domestic drones, relayed coordinates, tools costing hundreds of dollars were defeating Russian systems worth millions. The contrast was stark. Russia was using expensive ballistic missiles, armored battalions, and sprawling logistics hubs. Partisans were using telegram channels, 3D printers, and household chemicals. Yet Moscow struggled more against the latter. In occupied Ukraine, Russia attempted to impose order through fear. According to multiple reports from the Kyiv Independent and Pravda, the occupation authorities carried out arrests, kidnappings, and long prison sentences, including 20-year and life terms for a single family accused of rail sabotage. The goal was simple: intimidate the population into silence. But repression only amplified resistance. Every arrest removed civilians who had already accepted the risks. Every harsh sentence radicalized 10 more. Inside Russia, the resistance grew for different reasons. Some citizens opposed the war on moral grounds. Others resented mobilization, censorship, economic hardship, or the increasing power of the security state. Still others were motivated by personal loss: sons drafted, jobs disappearing, freedoms erased. According to investigative work published by independent Russian journalists in exile, many early resistance networks formed not as militant groups but as support circles, green ribbons, underground literature, anonymous online forums. These circles later connected with Ukrainian Ukrainian intelligence, transforming frustration into coordinated sabotage. The battlefield lines, once clear, were now blurred. Ukraine fought Russia in trenches and towns, but partisans fought Russia in rail yards, barracks, power grids, fuel lines, and the very cities the Kremlin claimed were untouchable. And that shift mattered because it forced Moscow into a dilemma no authoritarian state wants to face. When danger comes from within, where do you point the guns? The escalation began quietly, almost invisibly, until the pattern snapped into focus. The first clue emerged in Melitopol, a city Russia has held since the opening phase of the invasion. On the surface, Melitopol looked tightly controlled. Heavy checkpoints, armored patrols, constant surveillance. Yet beneath that facade, the region had become what Euromaidan press called the furnace of resistance, a place where every street, warehouse, and rail spur concealed potential danger. In early November, partisans planted an explosive device inside a vehicle assigned to a Russian drone crew. The car malfunctioned at the last moment, preventing the detonation. Russian commanders dismissed the incident as a technical fault, but intelligence analysts reported that the sabotage attempt matched at least 9 earlier Melitopol operations over the past year. It was the first tremor of a larger wave. Days later, the second strike hit Luhansk, deep inside territory Moscow claimed was fully secured. 2 Russian vehicles carrying officers were rigged with explosives. Both detonated at precisely timed intervals, one at 7:14 a.m., the other at 7:26. 4 Russian troops were lost instantly. The precision startled the occupation authorities. These weren't crude bombs thrown from the roadside. Someone had accessed the vehicles, planted the charges, monitored movements, and triggered them with near-surgical coordination. Then a third echo came from Kherson, where pro-Russian Chechen officers had been targeted months earlier. The Kyiv Independent documented that attack in May. Another vehicle, another explosion, again eliminating 4 pro-Russian fighters. The repetition across time and territory revealed a deeply unsettling truth. The resistance wasn't improvising anymore. It was refining techniques, improving target selection, and increasing operational tempo. But the shadow war did not stay contained within Ukraine's borders. The next escalation unfolded in Crimea, where infiltrators conducted an operation unlike any previous one. They didn't plant explosives or torch relay cabinets. Instead, they slipped into an area overlooking the Saki Air Base, one of Russia's most important aviation hubs in the region. There, they recorded fighter jets launching and landing, providing Ukraine with real-time visibility into Russia's air operations. Euromaidan press later confirmed that this intelligence was transmitted directly to Ukrainian forces. It wasn't a strike, but it set the stage for one, offering insights into Russian air patterns, runway schedules, and aircraft composition. Then came the Kursk incident, a major turning point. On November 5th, the Kyiv Independent reported that a critical transport loading vehicle used for Iskander ballistic missiles had been destroyed. These vehicles are essential. They carry, load, and prepare missiles for launch. Without them, Russia's ability to strike Ukraine's infrastructure is severely hampered. But the most important detail was who carried out the operation. Not Ukrainian Special Operations Forces. Not her. It was a Russian partisan group known as Black Spark. This single fact shocked analysts. A Ukrainian-aligned Russian faction had struck directly at one of Putin's most prized strategic assets. Black Spark didn't stop there. Euromaidan press added that partisans sabotaged a Harmonia radar, crippling local air defenses. The twin attack, neutralizing a missile loader and blinding the radar network, created a temporary corridor for Ukrainian drones to penetrate deeper into Russian territory. It also triggered one of the largest internal security deployments Kursk had seen since the war began. But even that wasn't the peak. 4 days after Kursk, new fires lit up Bashkortostan and Volgada. Communications towers collapsed, railway relay cabinets burned, and logistics hubs went offline. Russian officials described the incidents as unexplained failures, but the pattern matched earlier partisan signatures. In total, 4 major logistics facilities were hit, and while none caused permanent damage, all triggered delays in troop movements and fuel distribution. Delays measured not in minutes, but in days. The most cinematic escalation, however, came from Moscow, the fortress city, the political core, the place Putin believed untouchable. On November 1st, Ukrainian military intelligence, HUR, carried out a drone strike on the Ring pipeline, a massive fuel artery supplying aviation fuel to multiple Russian bases. According to the Kyiv Independent, the pipeline handled more than 3 million tons of fuel per day. Its temporary shutdown forced emergency rerouting and slowed Moscow's aviation logistics. But here was the twist. Euromaidan press suggested that Moscow-based infiltrators may have provided reconnaissance and targeting data for the strike. If true, this meant Ukrainian intelligence now had collaborators operating inside the capital itself, just miles from the Kremlin. 3 weeks, 6 major regions, dozens of coordinated attacks, all pointing to one conclusion. The Shadow War had matured into a synchronized, multi-front campaign that Putin could neither predict nor stop. And the most alarming realization came from within Russia's security apparatus. This wasn't just sabotage. This was a proxy insurgency spreading across the world's largest country, one that used Russia's own size, aging infrastructure, and internal fractures against it. The November wave of sabotage did more than embarrass the Kremlin. It exposed structural vulnerabilities in Russia's war machine, vulnerabilities that conventional militaries seldom reveal, but insurgencies exploit with precision. Each partisan operation, whether a vehicle explosion or a communications tower fire, had a multiplier effect far beyond the immediate damage. And as analysts from Reuters, BBC, DW, and Defense News repeatedly noted throughout 2024 and early 2025, Russia's war effort is profoundly dependent on a fragile ecosystem of logistics, fuel lines, and manpower stretched across 11 time zones. The first strategic impact emerged in Russia's military logistics network, a system that relies heavily on railways. According to Jane's defense data, more than 70% of Russia's military transport depends on rail for moving ammunition, armor, and personnel. When Partisans destroyed relay cabinets in Volgograd and communications towers in Bashkortostan, the disruptions cascaded down the network. Delays that would normally last minutes now extended into 18 to 36-hour bottlenecks. Commanders were forced to reroute trains, halt convoys, and reorganize timetables already strained by winter weather and overstretched repair crews. Russia's economy felt the second shock. The attack on Moscow's Ring pipeline, the artery that pumped roughly 3 million tons of aviation fuel, gasoline, and diesel daily, forced emergency resource shuffling. DW reported that after the strike, at least 10% of scheduled fuel shipments to airbases near the capital were postponed or diverted. The Russian finance ministry has repeatedly warned that the 2025 war budget, estimated at nearly $166 billion, more than a third of all federal spending, leaves little room for large-scale infrastructure repairs. Every burned relay box, every damaged radar, every destroyed fuel line forces Russia to spend money it does not have. Then came the manpower strain. Russia's mobilization system, already under pressure from conscription fatigue and demographic decline, now had to reassign thousands of security personnel to guard railways, depots, air bases, and city infrastructure. A BBC investigation found that by late 2024, Russia had diverted up to 30,000 National Guard troops away from frontline duties to internal security roles. After the November attacks, that number climbed higher. The Kremlin cannot deploy these forces to Ukraine while also guarding infrastructure across a country spanning 6,000 miles. Ukraine benefits from the inverse dynamic. Every sabotage act forces Russia to compensate by shifting personnel or equipment, creating gaps at the front. Ukrainian commanders leverage these gaps by pressing small offensives, rotating depleted units, or exploiting reduced artillery fire caused by supply delays. Defense News analysts highlight that even a single destroyed Iskander transport vehicle, like the one hit in Kursk, can disrupt Russia's strike capabilities for weeks. These launch systems depend on specialized loaders, not easily replaced, not easily protected. The psychological impact is harder to quantify, yet equally profound. Russian citizens in affected regions, from Irkutsk to Moscow, woke to emergency sirens, unexplained fires, or the eerie glow of burning relay stations. The Kremlin's messaging, calling attacks technical failures, no longer convinces a population already conditioned by years of wartime censorship. Independent Russian journalists living in exile note a rise in quiet dissent, people whispering about the failures of the security services, doubting state television narratives, or quietly celebrating each disrupted supply line. For Putin, this erosion of confidence is catastrophic. Authoritarian systems rely not only on control, but on the perception of control. The moment citizens believe the state cannot protect fuel lines, rail yards, airports, or even its capital, the illusion cracks. The Shadow War forces the Russian government into a defensive crouch, reactive instead of proactive. Instead of dictating the tempo, the Kremlin finds itself scrambling, chasing ghosts, and allocating resources to invisible enemies. International markets have also reacted. According to Bloomberg, Russian energy disruptions triggered by sabotage contributed contributed to temporary volatility in European fuel prices. Insurance premiums for Russian shipping and logistics rose between 12% and 18% following reported incidents. The country's GDP forecast for 2025, already weakened by sanctions, may contract by up to 2 to 3% if attacks continue at the current pace, according to analysts cited by Reuters. The final strategic impact is the one Moscow fears most: coordination between Ukrainian intelligence and Russian citizens. If even a fraction of the sabotage operations inside Russia were supported by insider reconnaissance, as suggested by Euromaidan Press in the pipeline strike, then Ukraine now possesses a strategic advantage that traditional armies rarely achieve. It's not just fighting Russia on the battlefield, it's fighting Russia from inside Russia. And the Kremlin has no playbook for that. The shadow war unfolding inside Russia is not an isolated phenomenon. Its consequences ripple outward, reshaping strategic calculations across NATO, the European Union, China, and the broader geopolitical landscape. What began as localized sabotage now intersects with the global balance of power, influencing military doctrine, economic resilience, alliance cohesion, and great power diplomacy. In Washington, under President Trump's administration, briefings from U.S. intelligence agencies in early 2025 highlighted a striking theme. Russia is no longer threatened only at its external borders. It is threatened from within, and that vulnerability alters strategic planning across multiple continents. For NATO, the surge in partisan operations is both a warning and an opportunity. On one hand, alliance planners see Russia's internal instability as evidence that Moscow's ability to sustain long-term offensives is weakening. Analysts at Defense News note that Russia's internal sabotage challenges the Kremlin's ability to mass forces along the Ukrainian front. Every disrupted railway, every damaged logistics hub, every fuel shortage slows the tempo of Russian offensives. NATO observers compare this phenomenon to logistical erosion, a gradual hollowing of Russia's capacity through strikes far from the battlefield. But NATO strategists also see a secondary risk: unpredictable Russian escalation. A weakened Kremlin facing internal infiltration might overcompensate with aggressive missile tests, nuclear signaling, or increased deployments near NATO borders. In January 2025, Reuters reported an uptick in Russian bomber flights over the Arctic and additional troop rotations through Kaliningrad. These moves appeared designed to project strength outward even as Russia struggled at home. Europe's position is equally complex. EU member states, especially Poland, Germany, and the Baltic nations, view the sabotage campaign as proof that Ukraine's intelligence services are adapting faster than Russia's security apparatus. Yet, European leaders also recognize the risks of a destabilized Russia, particularly one with vast energy reserves, a massive nuclear arsenal, and a political elite wary of appearing weak. The European Commission's internal assessment for 2025, leaked to DW, warned that sustained attacks on Russian infrastructure could provoke retaliatory cyber operations against European power grids, banking networks, and transportation systems. Energy markets feel the strain as well. The attack on the Ring pipeline, which moved millions of tons of fuel across western Russia each day, briefly disrupted global oil futures. Analysts at Bloomberg highlighted a spike of nearly 4% in regional aviation fuel prices after the November strike. While short-lived, such volatility underscores how sabotage inside Russia can reverberate across global markets. China observes all of this with a different lens. Beijing wants a stable Russia, strong enough to counterbalance US power, yet dependent enough on Chinese technology and trade to remain pliable. Internal instability threatens that balance. Chinese strategists writing in open academic journals warn that widespread sabotage could force Moscow to divert economic resources from energy exports, resources China increasingly depends on under its 30-year gas agreement with Russia. A Russia consumed by domestic sabotage becomes a less reliable partner, and for Beijing, reliability is worth more than brute strength. Meanwhile, Middle Eastern powers see advantages in Russia's internal vulnerability. Turkey, long pursuing its own interests in the Black Sea and Caucasus, quietly expands intelligence cooperation with Ukraine. Israel, balancing complex relations with both Kyiv and Moscow, monitors Russia's weakened air defense posture with interest, especially given continued tensions over Syria. Iran, however, moves in the opposite direction, reinforcing ties with Moscow, exporting more drones, and viewing Russia's internal weakness as leverage to extract better deals and military concessions. Underlying all these global reactions is a technological shift. The shadow war has demonstrated that inexpensive tools, drones costing $5,000, explosives printed on consumer 3D machines, encrypted messaging apps, can cripple assets worth billions. NATO air forces rely on jets costing $70 to $120 million each. Russia depends on ballistic missiles worth several million apiece. China deploys hypersonic glide vehicles costing tens of millions. Yet partisans with $200 components can blind radars, derail trains, and force superpowers to reroute strategic fuel supplies. This asymmetry is transforming global doctrine. Western militaries now analyze partisan operations as case studies in micro-attrition warfare, where dozens of low-cost disruptions neutralize high-value assets more effectively than conventional strikes. In its 2025 report, Jane's Defense observed that Russia's rear-line vulnerabilities resemble those of imperial powers in the 20th century: vast territory, limited infrastructure security, and overconfidence in central authority. Looking ahead 3 to 6 months, analysts forecast multiple scenarios. In the best case for Ukraine, partisan networks expand, further eroding Russia's logistics and diminishing its offensive capacity. This could force Moscow into more defensive operations, providing Kyiv with breathing room to rebuild brigades and reorganize its drone industry. Another scenario sees Russia escalating asymmetric responses, cyber attacks, energy pressure, or covert operations in Europe in an attempt to force Ukraine's allies to restrain sabotage activities. A third scenario, viewed with particular concern by NATO planners, involves internal fractures within Russia's regions. If sabotage continues to grow in Bashkortostan, Dagestan, and the Urals, as recent intelligence suggests, regional separatism could re-emerge, echoing the tensions of the early 1990s. A Russia distracted by internal fragmentation would be less aggressive abroad, but also more unpredictable. One truth, however, is clear across all assessments. The shadow war reshapes not only the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but also the global strategic environment. Superpowers accustomed to traditional warfare now face a world where resistant cells, not battalions, may dictate the flow of events. And this raises the most consequential question of all. What happens when the world's largest nuclear-armed state begins losing control? Not at its borders, but at its core. The shadow war now engulfing Russia marks a turning point, one not defined by grand offensives or sweeping territorial gains, but by thousands of quiet disruptions that collectively erode the foundation of Putin's power. Over a single month, partisans struck Russian vehicles in Melitopol, detonated charges in Luhansk, gathered reconnaissance in Crimea, crippled key logistics hubs in Bashkortostan and Volgograd, destroyed an Iskander support vehicle in Kursk, and enabled a drone strike against Moscow's Ring pipeline. These events, documented by Euromaidan Press, the Kyiv Independent, Reuters, and other major outlets, form a mosaic of resistance demonstrating that Russia's control is no longer absolute. And that is Putin's true crisis. Not the temporary loss of equipment, not the burning of relay cabinets, not even the disruption of aviation fuel. The real crisis is that his enemies are no longer only soldiers on the battlefield. They are technicians, commuters, students, factory workers, and railway engineers. They are Russians and Ukrainians operating in silence, hidden among ordinary life, deciding for themselves where the front line begins. This war behind the war, once scattered and improvisational, has evolved into a synchronized network of micro-attacks that drain resources Russia cannot afford to lose. Every disrupted timetable forces commanders to reorganize. Every damaged radar creates vulnerabilities. Every underground cell that remains uncaptured undermines the illusion of state control. And as 2025 progresses, the pressure only grows. Analysts from DW and Janes note that Russia now spends nearly a third of its national budget on defense, squeezing social programs and accelerating public frustration. Ukraine, meanwhile, gains not only intelligence and tactical advantages, but also time to rebuild brigades, expand drone production, and refine long-range strike capabilities. The shadow war doesn't bring rapid victories, but it fuels a slow-motion collapse of Russian operational resilience. The Kremlin still insists it has everything under control, but fires from Irkutsk to Moscow suggest otherwise. And so the conflict enters a new phase, a phase shaped not by armored assaults, but by shadows, by the choices of individuals who operate without formal ranks, yet impact the strategic balance as profoundly as tanks or aircraft. Three questions now dominate the minds of analysts across Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv. Will the resistance movement grow faster than the Kremlin can suppress it? Will Russia's internal fractures widen into political or regional instability? And if the shadow war continues to escalate, could it eventually force force Moscow to change its strategy or even its leadership? This story is far from over. Share your thoughts below, join the discussion, and subscribe for more deep analysis as this conflict enters its most unpredictable